After the 1969 model year, Chevrolet was highly jealous of the success that Pontiac was having with its personal luxury coupe, the Grand Prix, which was introduced for the 1969 model year. As a result, Chevrolet product planners, designers, and engineers committed to building a new vehicle for the 1970 model year and, frankly, kind of rushed it into the marketplace because they wanted to capitalize on Pontiac's success. This vehicle would be the 1970 Monte Carlo. This cross-brand rivalry was no doubt in part fostered by the fact that then Chevrolet general manager Pete Estes had previously been Pontiac's general manager. And at the time, Pontiac's general manager was John DeLorean. Estes had been promoted to become head of Chevrolet a few years earlier, and DeLorean would actually succeed him in 1969 to become Chevrolet's general manager and get the pleasure of introducing the Monte Carlo, although he really never had much to do with that first-gen Monte Carlo's introduction or its overall development. That 1970 Monte Carlo was built atop the A Special platform that it shared with the Grand Prix, which gave it that long hood, short deck proportion. In fact, the Pontiac Grand Prix had GM's longest hood at the time, and the Monte Carlo wasn't too far behind, with, again, an elongated hood and very short, kind of stubby-looking rear. However, the car proved quite successful in the marketplace, and as such, it was determined that a second-generation Monte Carlo was going to be introduced. This second-generation Monte Carlo was originally conceived for an earlier model year, but its release was pushed to the 1973 model year in part due to the GM UAW strike that occurred in the early 1970s. This resulted in a few interesting consequences that we'll discuss in a little bit. But for now, let's take a look at some of the original artwork associated with this second-generation Monte Carlo. Here you have an early sketch for the second-generation Monte Carlo. Notice that there's a number of similar themes between this and the production car, but there is one big thing that's missing, and that is the large bumper on the front. Recall 1973 was the year in which the 5-mile-an-hour impact standard was first implemented in the front. And then in 1974, that 5-mile-an-hour impact standard was implemented in the front and the rear. So when designers were sketching this car several years prior to its introduction, those bumper standards were not yet being contemplated. However, you could see a number of common themes. The single headlights on either side, the beautiful surfacing there on the hood with kind of this like cone-shaped surface that emanates from that area between the fender and the, I guess I'll call it, prow of the hood on either side. And the egg crate grille, kind of an homage to Cadillac, a bit of a upper end styling cue. You'll also note that this grille in the sketch is divided into two parts, and that was something that would not make it through to production. The grille was just one piece going all the way across. But overall, pretty similar, this sketch at least, to what the final vehicle would look like. Let's take a look at some more original artwork. Notice here a similar single headlight theme is occurring on this particular sketch, but the front end is very different. You don't have a heavy, chunky bumper, but the bumper on this vehicle does bisect the grille, something that would occur on a number of Chevrolets of that era, including the 1972 Caprice. You still have that surface that exists between the fender peak as well as the shoulder on the hood, but it's a bit different shape here. That shoulder has been pulled further inward toward the center line of the body, so it gives it a bit more area around the headlights to create a different surface. This sketch also really exaggerates the so-called tumble home on the vehicle. In other words, that the roof panel is narrower than the main section of the body, and the vehicle kind of tumbles inward as the body goes upward. Here's an early full-size clay model that's been coated with so-called Dynoc film. That's basically a film that gets stretched over the clay to make it look like the car is painted and has real glass in it. But it's just an illusion, although a good one at that. Again, you can tell at this point that there's not that bumper standard in the front. And this looks pretty similar to the first sketch that we saw. But the grille, again, is one piece. It does have that egg crate texture, but it's a smaller egg crate. And the pontoon fenders there, bladed fenders, look, I would say, a little bit like the 1970 Toronado up front, although this car only has the single headlights. And you can tell that there's two different proposals on either side of this car. Notice the bumper treatment on the passenger side versus the driver's side. On the passenger side, the bumper goes underneath the headlight. On the driver's side, it kind of bisects the headlight. This is a typical technique that designers would employ just to see how two different themes looked on a vehicle. Notice there also appears to be more of a gaping hole, I would say, on the driver's side proposal here as opposed to the passenger side surrounding the grille. Not quite sure what that is. Perhaps a area for air intake and ventilation of the underhood area. Of course, this car is obviously wearing wire wheels. That was something that GM styling chief Bill Mitchell was very fond of. These look very similar to the Jaguar E-Type wheels. And, well, I guess that was the intent. Also notice that this car has toothpick A-pillars like the full-size rear-wheel drive vehicles that came out in 1971. And it has an interesting diving belt line that kind of starts high at the front of the front door and then gently curves downward all the way through till when it scoops around and then meets the sail panel and goes up into the roof. Kind of a interesting looking proposal, let's just see. This proposal occurred likely before the opera window treatment that the final Monte Carlo would get was being complemented, and perhaps was even before the rollover standard was being contemplated. That rollover standard was really what created the so-called colonnade cars of the era from GM, or the cars with that very prominent sail panel, often with an opera window in them, in the coupes. And to that exact point, here's what I would guess is a later proposal for the 73 Monte Carlo. Notice here that this car has the opera window, and it's actually modeled with a vinyl top on it, which is generally anathema to designers, but clearly that's what this is. I have to say that I absolutely love this full-size model. I think the surfacing on the sides is absolutely gorgeous. I love the rear end treatment with the light bumper and the vertical taillights, likely an homage to Cadillac. And of course, the first generation Monte Carlo also had vertical taillights as well. But this bumper looks beautifully dainty as well as somewhat muscular at the same time. And that undulating surfacing just shows off the various highlights of the vehicle, and I think it looks absolutely gorgeous. I also like the belt line and how it goes from the front of the front door to the rear and then kind of scoops up at the end of the front door to meet the bottom of the vinyl top. I think that's a really cool treatment. Also gets the car a little bit more glass area. My guess is maybe this proposal was scrapped, or at least that element of it was scrapped, because you probably couldn't drop the door glass all the way with this particular proposal. As I said, this obviously has the opera window in it, and that would become a signature of the GM Colonnade cars. And one of the things that was interesting about this Monte Carlo's development was that because the car was delayed and designers knew they wanted to have the opera window on these vehicles, they actually went and changed the proposal for the 1971 Eldorado to incorporate an opera window as opposed to hardtop style glass on that two-door coupe, because they wanted the Eldorado to have a look that would be very similar to the later Monte Carlo. In other words, a look would be introduced on the Cadillac, and then it would kind of trickle down to other vehicles, including this Monte Carlo. And that was a very successful play. You always start a styling trend with the most expensive vehicle and trickle it downward. You don't do the inverse, which GM actually did in some cases, like the 1985 Buick Somerset and the 1986 Buick Riviera. 1 year later, the Riviera was introduced after the Somerset, and obviously the Riviera was the more expensive car. That's taboo. But here it worked very well. And here we have a final proposal for the 1973 Monte Carlo. Appears to be a full-size clay that's die-knocked in black, and it's an absolutely gorgeous front end. This, to me, is what I wish the 1973 Monte Carlo's front end would have looked like. But my guess is that because of that bumper standard, designers had to change the front end at least a bit. And it came out, well, the theme came out a bit more muted, I think, than what they had originally intended. This, to me, is a great and gorgeous successor to the 1971 car. You can also notice that here they've put fender bulges on the vehicle. Notice the top of the fender peak, and then that bulge that occurs outboard of it. Kind of similar to the first generation Monte Carlo. That would get, well, a bit toned down in the production model, but here I think this full-size clay is absolutely gorgeous and a stunner. Let's listen to some comments by former GM design vice president Irv Ribicki about the development of the 1973 Monte Carlo. At the time of its development, Ribicki was in charge of Chevrolet Studio and certainly had a front-hand seat and played a great role in its design. If you'll note here, I also believe that he talks about this black Dynoct model and showing it to John DeLorean and his team and their reaction. Let's listen in.
Do you remember something like the Monte Carlo? Here's a prestige, top-of-the-line sort of thing. How did that come about? What sort of thinking went into that?
We had what brought that about? The need for a four-place coupe, luxury coupe, created the first Monte Carlo, the shapes of which we weren't too happy about. It was a 73 car we loved very well. And that came together from one illustration on the board by one designer. We modeled that vehicle out. John DeLorean was then general manager of Chevrolet. And I never did show it to him. We kept it concealed until we finished it. And when we had finished it, we Dynocked the car in black with silver glass. And John liked to travel with a large entourage. When he came over here, it was a group of 40, 45 people. They'd fill up a studio, you know. And he walked in, and I told him, now, John, you and your team stay right there. I'm going to show you something. And we pulled the full-size boards away, and this black jewel was sitting there, and there was total silence for 30 seconds. And they started applauding. And they applauded like nothing you'd ever heard in a theater. And naturally, we're all very happy, and John said to me, don't touch it. Just release it the way it is. Their first look at the car. We're pretty proud of that. You know, that's a hell of an accomplishment, because usually you're in the harangue with the car division. They like this and they don't like that. And sometimes we'll bend for them, and other times we will not. I take it to a higher court. But that was one of our successes in Chevrolet, putting that car together.
Has remained so.
Pardon me?
It has remained so.
It has remained so, and I can tell you a little story about that car. That automobile was supposed to be introduced to the public in 1971. And then General Motors was hit by a UAW strike, and the whole program was postponed. In the meantime, they were tooling a new Eldorado that we'd done a few years before in Cadillac. And it had conventional side glass, and we had this little opera window in the Monte Carlo, big sail panel with a little opera window. And I said to Bill and Ed Cole, we were talking in the hallway one day, and I said, you know, now that this A car is stalled, this new Monte Carlo, I think it would be good marketing strategy to put that opera window in the Cadillac Eldorado in '71. Get it out there, and then let it appear in this lower-priced car, and it's just going to give that car a lift. And Ed Cole said to Bill, I like that. Get Fisher Body on the phone. Because the Cadillac was already on its way. And he put a lot of pressure on a lot of people, and they got that opera window in the Cadillac. We modeled it quickly. Took us about 4 days. And got the Fisher people over, gave them rough drawings. They went back and changed the tools and the dies and got it into production. And it did precisely what we believed it would do. When those A cars came out with the little opera windows, everybody felt, my, I've got a little Cadillac here.
Well, and there you have it, the story of the 1973 Monte Carlo's development told by the chief designer at the time. Here's a side profile of the 73 Monte Carlo, at least the final one, and you'll note the opera window that Mr. Ribicki was referring to here. And take a look at the inset photo of the 1971 Eldorado side profile, and you see the similarity between the two of them. You'll also notice in the side profile of the 73 Monte Carlo that so-called long hood, short deck profile. Look how long the hood is relative to the trunk on the vehicle. That was kind of a European styling cue, if you will, of the era that some stylists tried to impart on clearly non-European cars, but it worked overall. And you can also see that body side surfacing and sculpture. I think it's in production form, it didn't end up quite as beautiful as one of those clay models that I showed before, but it still was a handsome vehicle overall, and clearly the car sold well, selling 250,000 units in the 1973 model year, the first year for this body style. In this rear three-quarter view, you can see the cool taillights of the 73 Monte Carlo. Those would be 1 year only, as well as the somewhat light bumper, not as light as the proposal that we previously showed. But in 1974, as I mentioned, the rear impact standards would come into play and the bumper would get considerably more chunky. You can also see something at the bottom of the vehicle on the underbody hanging down there. It looks like a rod. That is the rear stabilizer bar. Front and rear stabilizer bars became standard on the Monte Carlo in 1973. You previously had to get the SS package to get a rear stabilizer bar on the 70 to 72s, but General Motors wanted to endow these vehicles with good handling as well as a good ride, and that was the result for the Monte Carlo. And while these vehicles were certainly large, they weren't as large, obviously, as the full-size cars. They rode atop a 116-inch wheelbase compared to the Caprice Impala's 121.5-inch wheelbase, and they measured about 213 inches in overall length. They were far longer cars in General Motors stable, but this was an intermediate-sized car, if you want to call it an intermediate-sized vehicle, and well, a handsome one at that, shall we say. Let's take a look at the interior. Now, if we're honest with ourselves, the interior of this 73 Monte Carlo is kind of a letdown, at least in my opinion. I don't think that the dash has a great theme. The materials aren't that great. Kind of a letdown also versus the 70 to 72 generation. Although the door panels here still do have some real stitching in them, but the instrument panel just doesn't do anything for me. Doesn't have a great theme, doesn't have great materials, doesn't look very captivating, doesn't go along with the exterior of the car. Although by 1973, at least, you did get in this Monte Carlo a interior colored steering wheel, as opposed to the Caprice and Impala for 71 and 72. You just got the black steering wheel. Although you did have quite a bit of black plastic trim on the instrument cluster here in the Monte Carlo, and you got some faux wood grain around that speedometer and fuel gauge in this case. Here's another look at the instrument cluster. You can see that this car has the optional air conditioning based on the HVAC controls, and it has those squishy knobs to turn the radio. I do like those in Chevrolets. They had this unique kind of squishy knob that was pliable when you touched it. I thought it actually had a nice feel to it. This car does also have a tilt steering wheel, and on the door panel, you'll notice it has that remote mirror control on the inside there. That was an option. And the crotch cooler beneath the steering column to help keep your entire body cool, shall we say, with the freezing cold air conditioning that these General Motors cars employ. This particular vehicle also has the standard bench seat. Notice there's no armrest up front. That was true also for the 70 to 72 Monte Carlo, nor is there an armrest in the rear. Well, the bench seat looks inoffensive, and I will say that they are comfortable. General Motors made good bench seats in this era, and I would say they were more comfortable than the bench seats from Chrysler or Ford. The Chrysler bench seats, you kind of pogo sticked around up and down, in part because of the rear leaf spring setup. I don't think the seat engineers talked to the chassis engineers for Chrysler, because you always seemed to be bouncing up and down in the seat as you rode down the roadway. You'll also notice on the door panel here that there's a relatively small padded section of the door armrest. The armrest is a full armrest, but only a portion of it is padded. So Chevrolet was saving a bit of money on the interior with that. Turning now under hood of this particular Monte Carlo, you'll see that this car has a 350 cubic inch Chevrolet small block. This is actually the optional 354 barrel V8 that made, I believe, 175 horsepower. The standard 352 barrel V8 made 145 horsepower. And the top optional engine at the time was the Chevrolet Big Block 454 V8, making 245 horsepower. So power ratings were starting to come down in 1973, although it wasn't quite as bad as the 1975 model year, which I think was the worst, because that was the first year with the catalytic converter. Also notice the extremely large fan shroud here that is due to the elongated hood on the Monte Carlo. So with that elongated hood, you have to make sure that you're able to actually draw air through the radiator, and given where the engine is placed relative to the radiator, it necessitated the use of this very large fan shroud that's kind of comical, I would say. And over here on the driver's side, you have that big Frigidaire A6 air conditioning compressor that put a lot of cool air in the vehicles in the hot summertime. Those systems work wonderfully well. And you can see the cruise control transducer there on the driver's side fender. Well, you can actually adjust the speed at which the cruise engages. So if you have one of these setups and you push the cruise button and the speed drops 3, 4, 5 or more miles per hour before it engages, that is adjustable. Or likewise, if you push the set button and the car speeds up, you can adjust that out. And you'll also notice the evaporative canister there in the driver's side front corner. So overall, the 73 Monte Carlo, as I mentioned, was a smash success. Although, at least from my standpoint, it's a bit unfortunate that it wasn't able to be introduced to the marketplace with the styling that the designers had originally intended. I think that black Dynock proposal was just an absolute knockout, and it seems like John DeLorean and his crew, from what you heard Irv Verbicki say, also thought the same of the vehicle. But nonetheless, it was successful, and it would carry on until the 1977 model year, and then for 1978, a new Monte Carlo would be introduced. And that one, well, I'm not sure how I feel about that one. Let me know in the comment section what you think about that 1978 Monte Carlo, and even the 1978 Grand Prix would also be, let's just call it a different design. Some love them, some hate them, but put in the comments what you think about this 73 as well as that next generation Monte Carlo. Hope you enjoyed the spotlight on this 73 Monte Carlo. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching.